Hello, I'm Lara Natale from CERRE. A warm welcome to all of you watching. Thank you so much for taking the time. I'm from CERRE indeed, and it's great to kick off the first Tech Media Telecom event since the summer break. There are more of these to follow rather shortly, a hat trick in fact, and details on these later. So today we published an issue paper exploring questions very much under the spotlight at this moment of intensifying negotiations for the Digital Services Act, the DSA. The paper is titled, "What is the Harm in Very Large Online Platforms?" And its author, CERRE Research Fellow Broughton Micova, who also authored CERRE's DSA recommendations published back in December 2020, will set out how she thought about these complementary perspectives on theories around harm. And I think it's worth making clear up front that naturally the DMA and DSA were presented as a package. We will cross-refer here and there, but this isn't a discussion focused on competition per se versus regulation, as we might see more in the Digital Markets Act. And we're also not zoning in on the gatekeeper concept as set out in any depth within the DMA. So this is a more social political theory on content regulation around theories of harm. So this paper is in fact part of the DSA work stream that CERRE started some 16 months ago now. And we have some, not quite all, of the industry and national regulatory members that followed this work stream. And as you see on the event program today, the representatives are from Snap Inc., Vodafone, Mediaset, UK regulator Ofcom, and I will introduce the representatives after Sally's presentation of the paper. We'll also have the opportunity to hear from each speaker several times in the interactive workshop style that I like to hope helps us get as much possible to take away from the time we spent here today. As ever, we would like to get our viewers at this panel involved. We're warmly invited to submit questions to our speakers via the Slido using the hashtag CERRE platforms, or one word. Link is on our website or in the footer of our YouTube channel. And I will put questions to speakers when opportune. Lastly, we warmly encourage you to sign up to the free CERRE newsletter, because there we publish all the upcoming details on our events and general activities, publications and so forth. You'll find details if you're following on YouTube and indeed on our CERRE website, cerre.eu. Right, Sally, definitely time to hear from you. Congratulations. I find this has been a really thought-provoking process actually over the matter of some months. And it's great to see your nuanced understanding about the relationship between large size and the potential for systemic harm see the light of day. So over to you to present, and then after that, we'll have an interactive discussion with our distinguished speakers. Sally, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Lara. It has been a pleasure to work on this. It's been a pleasure to be thinking in this direction. Contrary to what was reported in Politico this morning, this paper is actually about how large platforms are harmful. It's about thinking about that in a different way so that we can inform the way that we might assess any potential systemic risk to society. So I will just share my screen here. Yeah. And if that is all good. So this is about interrogating the link between largeness and systemic risk of harm to society. And we've talked a lot in the last several years. There's been ongoing discussions about platform size, platform dominance, a lot of these concepts that come from competition policy, and now with systemic risk, we have a concept imported from financial market regulation. But particularly in the DSA, the concerns that we're trying to address are about public debate, public health, electoral processes, public security, fundamental rights. And it has never been the job of markets to protect these things, right? So what I wanted to do here was come at this from a different perspective and say, okay, the perspective aside, how else can we be thinking about harm in a way that might help us in order to decide how to think about what a systemic risk might be? So I came at this from a social and political theory perspective. I went all the way back to John Stuart Mill's, right, and the original kind of harm principle and where it moved since then, and different ways of thinking about harm. So firstly, if we go back to the original harm principle, we think, okay, the harm principle is used to say intervention should only be made in order to prevent harm to others. But that isn't just about individual harm, right? And harm, even in Mill's understanding of it, can come from a societal context, right? And this was even later developed to this idea about intermediary groups and communities, the extent to which a social environment can actually impinge on the autonomy of individuals, and that harm can come from that. And we also see a vein of thinking that talks about harm in its accumulative nature. So we might have a public harm that impinges on institutions, institutional practices, even essential services, right? And this public harm principle developed this is why we criminalize tax evasion, for instance. It doesn't harm a particular individual, but of course it affects our society and the state's ability to deliver essential services. And when we're talking about accumulation of harm, we might even see small, little tiny harms, which are insignificant, or even actions that not particularly harmful, that when accumulated over time and overspread, create harm in the social environment. And pollution is a classic example of this, but more in the kind of DSA vein. Think about hate speech, right? And hate speech or speech that maybe doesn't quite cross the boundary into hate speech, but is can have a harm to an individual. But we also need to be thinking about the way that accumulates and what kind of context, how does that then shape the social environment? And we do have now actual empirical evidence about how it normalizes a particular way of talking and normalizes hate in communication. Another way would be the ubiquitousness of consent, right? We all consent to cookies all of the time. It's almost automatic, right? And it might not be harming us necessarily, but it does perhaps normalize overall an impingement on our rights to privacy that then the state is not able to protect our right to privacy anymore. So we can see a degradation of social environment thinking. And we have to think about this in terms of what are the consequences for the state's ability to protect our fundamental rights. Not just protect us from impingement on fundamental rights, but also the positive obligations that arise out of our fundamental rights, what the state needs to be doing in order to enable us to actualize our fundamental rights. Now, I should say, in the thinking, the very theoretical thinking about harm, there's also treatment of benefit. Right? And of course, we do have great benefits from a lot of large online platforms. Right? We have benefits in terms of expression, we have benefits in terms of creativity and businesses, etc. But the literature, I think, is quite clear that the moral imperative to prevent harm always outweighs benefit, right? And it is not a clear balancing act. So that is the perspective that I'm coming from. What we have to deal with in the DSA is the notion of systemic risk, right? Which was imported from financial market regulation. But there are some fundamental characteristics of systemic risk. And one of the elements is the understanding of a contagion effect, right? A systemic risk is about the risk that a harm will spread across a system, right? And what we're looking for is the extent to which a whole system might be exposed to that risk of contagion. Now, crucial here are then the interconnections and dependencies that then exist, which might facilitate that contagion. And that is how you might define exposure, right? The extent of interconnection and dependencies that would be the definition of the exposure to any potential instability, right? And the contagion from that. And key here is, of course, defining the system. And this is where one of the areas I think we need a bit of work in perhaps the draft text. And oops, sorry, I didn't mean to go backward. If we look at financial regulation, we can see that the system is defined at the EU level, right? And there are thresholds at the EU level that allow them to define what that systemic risk might be and what actors might pose systemic risk. Right? There are also criteria relevant to this interconnection. So that has to do with subsidiaries in numbers of member states, right? Or the extent to which they have other different connections. So there's a short but clear list of criteria that reflect this interlinkages element of systemic risk. Another thing we see in the financial regulation is that member state systems are accounted for. And in financial regulation, there's a mechanism by which member state level authorities can flag up some company that might pose systemic risk to their own economy at the member state level, but doesn't necessarily fit the criteria of the thresholds at the EU level. And there is an understanding there that this member state systems are connected to EU-wide systems, right? But that this is also an area where we might look at systemic risk. And if we think back to the way harm and public harm might be operating in relation to effect on public institutions and public processes and social contexts, the national level, I argue, is certainly important. Now, the DSA deals with 3 areas of systemic risk. It asks for risk assessments to be conducted in 3 particular areas. And in working on the paper, after looking at these 3 areas, I introduced a 4th. and the reason for that is essentially that, as I'll explain in a minute, media pluralism, I think, is a distinct area of risk. So I'll go through these one by one quickly. So in terms of the dissemination of illegal content, and here we're talking about content that in some areas of harmonization is illegal union-wide, but there's also content that is illegal only within certain jurisdictions. But we are talking to about individual harm and public harm that comes from the normalization, from the accumulation of the dissemination of these things, right? The gradual degradation of a social environment. And one of the other aspects when we're talking about illegal harm content is the extent to which any speaker or purveyor of this illegal content gains authority within a social context or within an intermediary group by the nature of them not being stopped. And an example of this from the offline world, which is easiest to distinguish, which came out of the literature, is when you have people on a crowded bus or tube carriage or something, and someone is speaking hate speech to one individual. If no one intervenes, that non-intervention has given that individual, who might be nobody, a certain level of authority, right? And that is something we see online all the time. People who are otherwise nobodies, so to speak, gaining authority within particular communities, within particular contexts online, right? When it comes to fundamental rights, we have again this issue of normalization, and we might be here normalization consensual harms. There is a whole area of thinking covers the extent to which people can consent to harm to themselves, right? And we might be normalizing an area of consensual harm. But another element might be the extent to which we're damaging states' abilities to fulfill positive obligations for the protection of these human rights. Now, in the draft of the DSA that was proposed, media plurality is part of the protection of fundamental rights. It's not dealt with separately, but it's acknowledged as one of the fundamental rights that needs protecting. However, I ended up separating it out after reviewing literature and evidence in relation to media pluralism. One of the reasons is that this ties very much, of course, to issues about competition and things that the MA is trying to deal with, and the gatekeeping and sustainability of media outlets and media companies. That we talk about as external plurality. And that is, of course, important. But I think there's another aspect of media pluralism that is important to be included here when we're talking about content. And here we have issues related to the extent to which people are exposed to diversity, and to the extent to which there is a pluralism of voices and of pluralism of people who can affect public opinion. So here, the nature of content moderation will be key, prioritization and findability, right? And also the way user behavior like trolling and bullying, which evidence has shown can silence particularly women, people from minority backgrounds, that the extent to which those are dealt with. So these point to particular areas that I think would be within the scope of the DSA in terms of assessing risk. And the final point, which is one of the three areas in the DSA, is intentional manipulation. Okay, so we're talking about this systemic risk that somebody can use the platform to intentionally manipulate things. And this is often thought of associated with electoral process, etc. And here, the extent and nature of dissemination of this kind of manipulation might depend on functionality and the linkages with other services and not just reach. Because it isn't simply a broadcast issue, but it can actually be about what's going on in smaller communities within intermediary groups, and harm to public institutions and systems as well as that context. So just to bring it to the conclusions, I tried to link sort of the theoretical aspect to the suggestions for the way we might progress with the Digital Services Act, and also the way we might progress afterwards in terms of what guidance for risk assessment is done, and what kind of things are looked at when we look at systemic risk. So the nature of publicness, of public harm, being much more than just how many people are reached and how many people are involved in a public space, leads me to recommend that we need to look also at member state system risk, right? And that there should probably be some kind of a mechanism in which member states can flag up some platform that is particularly poses a risk in their system. If you think about some of the member states, we have countries with very small populations. If 200, 300,000 people are using a platform in Slovenia or Estonia, that can be a significant amount of their population. That could have but it might not necessarily be a platform that has 45 million users on the European Union level. So members, because the DSA has this tiered approach, there I think is a vehicle, and we should look at some way of allowing member states to flag up for assessment platforms that don't necessarily reach thresholds. Also, if we think about the nature of accumulative harms, right? It's important to think about the fact that interlinkages things that might come down on one platform end up staying and having a long duration on other platforms that don't fit the definition of VLOPs, right? So we need to be thinking not just about what's happening within a particular platform ecosystem, but how that then connects to others. And longevity is as much of an issue here as dissemination spread. And finally, the fact that what we are concerned about involves the social environment and the roles of groups and communities and contexts and the extent to which people can influence public debate and the diversity there. I think that there is grounds for media pluralism to be a distinct area of risk that is examined from the DSA perspective and not just from a competition DMA kind of perspective. And I would suggest that we have risk assessments that are more open and participatory. And because we do have in the DSA transparency requirements, due diligence provisions that are a lot aimed at opening a lot of this stuff up, there's probably quite a lot of room for this to happen. But they need to be risk assessments that are not just closed within individual platform ecosystems, but that actually consider the link to the wider environment. And that is going to require participation, I think, from other people, and it will require a kind of feedback loop. This is going to be a learning process. Whatever happens, there should be built-in feedback loops with digital service coordinators, with the commission, with other stakeholders, so that there can be kind of iterations of the guidance as to what these systemic risk assessments look like. And I hope that made some sense, and I look forward to discussing it.
Thank you so much, Sally. Yes, lots of sense as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I noticed that particular in the conclusions towards the end, we come back to some language that we also saw, for example, in the CERRE DMA recommendations. So reminding us to an extent that this is a package indeed. I mean, if we think of participatory concepts, feedback loops, learning by doing. And I also noticed your various treatments around the concept of harm as you outlined in the slides. And of course, this idea of systemicness, which we'll come back to with the panel, and that the precedent flagged with the financial services example, because we clearly need to make sure as we firm up the DSA and go beyond it, that we fully capture the specificities of digitally disseminated content. And I think this is a great contribution to that debate. Thank you so much. Maybe just worth pointing to our viewers that CERRE does wider work around how we dovetail EU and member state regulatory systems, which Sally also pointed to. You might have seen our issue paper on new ways of oversight for the digital economy from a few months ago, and we'll publish a more detailed study on this in the next couple of months. So I think it's definitely time to open this out to our very nicely calibrated panel, which I'm proud to introduce. So warm welcomes to Tania van den Brande, Director of Economics for Ofcom. Hello, Tania. We also have Matthew Allison, Senior Public Policy Manager for Vodafone Group. Hope it's okay if I call you Matt, as I'm used to doing. Hello, Matt. Carolina Lorenzon is with us too. Carolina is Director for International Affairs at Mediaset. Good afternoon, Carolina. And lastly, we have also Lara Seritti, Head of Public Policy for Snap Inc. So a warm welcome to you all. Of course, Sally remains available throughout the discussion to chip in and take any questions. So I also think this represents a clear calibration of different sorts of market players impacted by DSA or VLOP categorization. So I think the Slido will now be open for questions under the hashtag CERRE platforms. Please let us know who you are and who you're representing, whether you have a panelist in mind for your question, Sally included, of course, and I'll start to take these after reactions to the paper from the panel. And I thought maybe we could start with Tania. So Tania, hi. From your economist Zoom lens, I wanted to ask you, given that this report looks at the non-economic side of the coin too, what has Ofcom, as the UK online harms regulator standpoint, UK also no longer being within the scope of the DSA per se, what has Ofcom taken away from this issue paper? What are your views?
Thanks, Lara, and thanks, Sally, for a really brilliant paper and presentation. And I think Sally, what your paper does really well is sort of draw out some of the complexities that policymakers will have to deal with as we finalize regulation. And I don't think I necessarily have all the answers, but there's three areas I wanted to briefly pause on as part of a follow-on to your paper. And the first point is really just a pause on why we are talking about that distinction between very large platforms and essentially everyone else. And I think there's an important dimension of proportionality there, and the question on whether we want to have more extensive intervention in relation to certain stakeholders. And I think what your paper illustrates very well is that at times we might want more extensive intervention because the risk of harm that certain platforms or certain services pose is particularly high. And I think the paper deals with that question very extensively. What the paper doesn't pick up, and I think for very good reasons, is that there might be other factors that are relevant in trying to articulate why it's proportionate to take more interventionist measures. And I think the first one is all around effectiveness. Do these additional interventions that you apply on a VLOP, are they always necessary to tackle high risk of harm? And are they always effective in addressing high risk of harm? And let me give you an example. Let's say you have a small platform that is really focusing on radicalizing individuals and trying to lead to off-platform harm in real life, if you like. Well, in those cases, you might have a very high risk of harm, but ultimately getting those platforms to do a risk assessment and ask them to take proportionate steps is probably not really going to get you anywhere. And maybe you might actually be already able to enforce against those platforms with some of the less intrusive measures that are part of the DSA. A second factor that might be at play as well is the cost of the intervention that you're introducing and the balance of that cost against the amount of risk of harm or harm that you can reduce. And what I can imagine is happening at the European level is that in part there is a bit of nervousness about the potential for these additional interventions to increase the cost of regulation to such an extent that we, for example, undermine competition in a way that might be sensed isn't sort of proportionate to the risk of harm that can be addressed. So that's, I suppose, a framework. And I think finding that balance between, on one hand, reducing risk of harm and effectiveness and cost of intervention is, I think, still very much up for debate. And I think what your paper does is a very good job at articulating that first element of understanding to what the extent the risk of harm might vary and why we might potentially, as a result of that, have more extensive interventions. And what I particularly like about the paper is sort of the argument that it's not necessarily just the case that the number of users of a platform give a good sense of the risk of harm. And I like this idea of interconnection, where you might have a platform that doesn't have a lot of users, but it might be very linked to other platforms. And as a result, harmful content on that smaller platform might spread very quickly and therefore have a really high risk of harm. I think other examples of this conversation is sometimes called displacement. And it's this idea where even if you're regulating or having stronger requirements on legal content for the big platforms, what you might end up doing is just shifting the harmful content across a wider range of smaller platforms. And really, ultimately, you end up with the same risk of harm. But I think there's two other reasons why risk of harm might not always be well correlated with the size of the platform in terms of users. And the first one is all about the fact that sometimes the individual harm of some users can be extremely high. And for those reasons, you might have a high risk of harm and potentially a reason for more interventionist measures. And I'd like to use the example of websites that facilitate the spread of user-generated pornographic content. And I think I don't have to draw a picture to let you know that if we know there is underage users, both in terms of viewing and creating that content on those platforms, what you can imagine is that the risk of harm for those platforms is really quite significant for children. And so in those cases, having really high thresholds in terms of number of users might actually limit your ability to capture those particular platforms that pose really a lot of risk to children. Another example might be where the harm is not necessarily related to the number of viewers that might see the harm, but potentially for actions to be taken by a few viewers of the content in real life, and to that extent generate harm not just on the platform, but way beyond it. And here I think hate speech and hateful content could be a really good example, because maybe all you need to do is radicalize one or two individuals that then can potentially engage in a terrorist attack, which generates really significant harm well beyond the users of the platform. And again, that is the type of systemic risk that might be hard to capture when you just look at the number of users of a platform. Now, how do you deal with that? Maybe one way to deal with that is to have different thresholds, and to have those thresholds be lower depending on the type of harm that you look at. And in particular, maybe some of the additional interventions that are put on VLOPs would be quite useful to have for illegal content on smaller platforms as well. And here I think the parallel with the UK proposals is a really interesting one, because essentially in the UK proposals, every platform that's subject to the online safety bill has to do a risk assessment in relation to illegal content, and has to take proportionate steps in order to address that type of content. And so therefore potentially is able to capture some of those examples around terrorist content and CSAM that I just mentioned. And then a third and a final point I wanted to bring up was something that I think is illustrated really well by the paper, which is harms online sometimes can be linked to each other. And I think that's really split across three broad buckets. I think the first bucket, Sally, you already mentioned very clearly, which is that sometimes issues on the competition side can have implications elsewhere. And this is very clear from the Cairncross review in the UK, which basically raises the concern that a lack of competition might reduce the ability of news publishers to monetize their content. And as a result of that, you might have a loss of quality news content in sort of a UK population, or the ability to access that by a UK population. And really what you see here is a link to competition issues creating harm elsewhere in terms of a lack of access to plurality of quality news. A second bucket of the type of interactions that you might get is that an intervention targeting one area of harm might have negative unintended consequences on another area of harm. And let's take our competition example, and let's say that a competition authority has the ability to tackle some of the market power issues that might exist in relation to very large or sort of gatekeeper platforms. And maybe the good thing is that that might lead to the monetization of quality news. We like that. But what might be less attractive is if that leads to the monetization of harmful content like hate speech and disinformation. And in those cases, you might want your authority to have the ability to think about those potential unintended consequences and mitigate them in this other policy area. And then a third bucket of interactions can be cases where you might have tensions between different harms, or tensions between trying to address different harms. And a potential example of that is the use of estimation techniques to understand how old a particular user on a platform is. And you might imagine that such techniques are very attractive because it can help you spot a child user and therefore allow you to tailor the protection of that user effectively, and essentially have higher levels of protection for child users. However, if that requires you as a platform to track that user and sort of take very detailed information of how that user engages with the platform, then maybe that raises questions in terms of privacy. Now, maybe that can be managed. Maybe you can get to the same estimation techniques without needing to infringe privacy. But maybe over time, we also find that there's a genuine trade-off to be had there. And then you might have to deal with that as a regulator. And essentially, I think what that means in practice is three things. I think, first of all, it might mean that as a regulator, you have to think about how harms interact and try and mitigate those unintended consequences. It might mean that you want to supplement different regulatory tools to achieve all the harms that you want to address in real life. And I think Sally's example of complementing the DSA with the DMA is a good example of that. And finally, where different regulators are responsible for different harms, what you might want to do is encourage regulatory interaction to make sure that actions are coherent. And that's why we in the UK introduced the DRCF, which is there to really facilitate coordination between the competition regulator, the forthcoming online safety regulator, which will be Ofcom, the data and privacy regulator, and financial authorities. So I think, Sally, what your paper brings out very nicely as well is that the implications of your paper have structural implications in terms of how regulators interact with each other. And
Thank you very much, Tania. Thank you. Right, I will proceed to the rest of the panelists for the rest of this round so we can continue the conversation. And I think off the back of that very comprehensive input, thank you, Tania, I'll come next to Matt. So Matt, as an international telco, also active in the TV content space, I think Vodafone's voice in the harmful content and platform size discussion help us calibrate the conversation. So could we please gain your reaction in just a couple of minutes, if you can, to the rich input in the issue paper? Thank you, Matt.
Absolutely. Many thanks, Lara, for the opportunity to speak here today and to share some reactions to the report. And thank you, Sally, for a really detailed and timely study. We think this is actually an opportune moment to consider as we're debating and discussing the formulation of the Digital Services Act, getting back to the principles that should underpin the regulatory intervention. And I think, you know, if this report can do anything, actually, it will be to help us do that. So just to share a few reflections from a Vodafone perspective, as you know, we're a global connectivity and communication service provider. And for us, the DSA is a really important piece of legislation. We think that there's an opportunity here to set the legal framework or reset the legal framework for digital services in a way that can endure, hopefully, for the next 20 years, as we benefited from the e-commerce directive legal framework that has endured for the past 20 years. And crucially here, we can clarify the responsibilities for intermediaries like Vodafone, but also content sharing platforms and everybody in between, with respect to their different roles within their ecosystem. And above all, to bake in fundamental rights, which I think is something that perhaps isn't as established or enshrined in the current legal framework. And I would just pick up on two words in Tania's intervention that chimed with me a lot: proportionality and effectiveness. And we think these are crucial to this effort. And, you know, in designing a regulation that is both proportionate and targeted, it's very important to avoid drawing service providers into scope who do not meaningfully contribute to the dissemination of harm online. For example, passive back-end service providers who are critical to the functioning of the internet, but whose services or businesses do not essentially involve disseminating material to the public. And we think this is a really important concept that should underpin the DSA. So the CERRE study is very timely in this regard. As I say, I think it brings us back to the basics of the DSA, which is what is the harm caused and which service providers should be subject to new obligations in order to tackle those harms. And our reading on our main reflection on the report is that certain service providers do indeed cause harm or give rise to greater harm precisely because they are big. And that size gives rise to a number of innate benefits, but also risks that should be addressed through EU legislation. And just to highlight a couple very quickly that really shone out from the report from our perspective, and looking here at, again, non-economic harms, we can put aside the issues raised in the context of the DMA for a moment. The first is obviously the public dissemination of illegal content, but also increased visibility of legal harmful content. The second, and one that I think we could almost branch off into a different study because it's not comprehensively addressed in this report, I think that's actually deliberate, you said, Sally, is the erosion of individual privacy, which occurs primarily as a result of a lack of consumer choice and a lack of incentives in order to compete on privacy when you have increased concentration in the market, but also data accumulation within the context of online platform services. And then the final, which I think is really interesting because it's less hard to nail down, it's a little bit more nebulous because it doesn't relate necessarily to individual harm, is the notion of societal harm that can occur, for example, through undermining of democratic processes, through eroding trust in institutions, which is the effect of, as I say, increased visibility and prominence of particularly misinformation and disinformation via online platforms. I think the first of those in particular around electoral processes, the jury is still out. It's quite hard to quantify and pin down exactly how and where this is happening. The second that I raised is probably more obvious and prominent, particularly through the pandemic that we've all been living through, making sure that we have trust in public institutions that provide important public health information. And this is a real harm that, undermining that faith and that trust can arise, particularly as a result of the size, the scale and the reach of certain content sharing platforms. So I think just in concluding, both the DSA but also this report, are very important, if not catch-all solutions, ways that we can move towards a more effective approach to dealing with illegal and harmful content online. And there are three things that we really believe that the DSA can help in doing so. The first is removing the perverse incentives that exist under the e-commerce directive in relation to service providers being able to proactively identify and remove infringing content. The second is actually moving service providers from a reactive to a proactive stance when it comes to dealing with content and material on their sites. And then the third, and I think most relevant to this particular study, is focusing on platform design and including, particularly for the large service providers who, on account of their size, do entail a greater risk, particular obligations that apply upfront in designing the service in a way which is safe and has the risks that could arise to users in mind. So I'll pause there, Lara, and happy to elaborate on any of those concepts, but just to underline again, thank you, really timely study and great to be involved.
Yeah, thank you for your support, Matt, and fully noted on your main takeaways as well, and of course the e-commerce directive word that originally launched the start of all these reflections, the concepts in the ECD, of course, which is rather a long-standing piece of legislation now. Let's come to Carolina. Carolina, hello, buongiorno, and thank you so much for having brought Mediaset's input to this issue paper as we developed it. A mass media company, commercial broadcaster, major TV publisher. This is, of course, a central angle within content regulation and how we think about harms in the ecosystem. So very interesting to hear about your reactions to Sally's paper. Thank you, Carolina.
Grazie, Lara. Well, thank you all. And I wish really to thank the whole CERRE team. This is a timely and a study which brings additional food for thought. That said, I believe that at this stage, it is perhaps not worth introducing further doubt into a process which is very well actually ongoing, and we need to get this legislation pretty fast. I think some of the harms clearly identified by Sally are actually addressed by the DMA. By the DSA. Of course, the DSA, DMA as a package cannot solve, the problems that continue to arise in the online space, because we keep on learning things. And Sally, you talked about, the public being nudged into certain behaviors, but I think also public discourse has been nudged into believing that freedom of expression prevails and that tech platforms are per se untouchable under that angle. And then guess what? We discovered that, this sacred cow of freedom of expression is actually supported by another cash cow, which is, the business model of most platforms, which depends on how content is actually optimized, organized, and eventually monetized. And I think in your paper, you also have taken into consideration these aspects. What I really like about the paper is that you balance out freedom of expression with other fundamental rights in our charter. On harm and size, I think you're right, in focusing on damage that can be done by small platforms in certain small member states, for example. But I think that the DSA is actually a horizontal proposal. It can't solve it all, but eventually, maybe with the Media Freedom Act, these issues can be further tackled. And thereby, I believe that this study is actually very important as additional food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. Interesting to hear these concepts around sacred cows and cash cows too, and how the two play together, up for debate as we continue in this debate, of course. Laura, let me come to you. Hello, and you're here, of course, bringing the voice of a social media company in Snap, and therefore perhaps with particularly close interest in the VLOP definition and how it might be applied. Very interested, therefore, to conclude this first round of reactions to Sally's issue paper with you. So you have the floor.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Sally and the CERRE team for this very interesting paper. From our perspective, I think what we like the most about the paper is that really provides useful food for thought on the fact that systemic risk of harm is not necessarily or exclusively a function of size. And this is something we've been discussing a lot internally, trying to understand the notion of systemic risk. We, at SNAP, we believe that this cannot be assessed only on the basis of the number of users. I also agree with what has been already mentioned by the other panelists. I mean, this is really timely. We just recently, together with other 6 platform operators, have issued a letter to major institutional stakeholders on the DSA, basically trying to advocate for a more proportionate and risk-based approach on the designation of very large online platforms, because we, again, believe that the high number of users alone cannot imply systemic risk. And I think what this paper does very well is to explore the different dimensions of harm and clarify essentially that public harm is not only the result of the accumulation of harm at large scale, but also has different facets. And it's important that those different dimensions are taken into account and reflected in the DSA, and particularly in the definition of very large online platform, to ensure basically that the rules are targeted and actually going back also to what was mentioned about proportionality. I mean, we think that this is the DSA has, of course, the objective, pursued objective of supporting and promoting the digital internal market, while at the same time creating a safe online environment and protecting fundamental rights. So we believe that the current approach fails to take into account all this complexity, and especially, I mean, that does not take into account the complexity of the systemic risk notion. And hopefully this paper is a useful starting point for further debate. Yeah, I will just pause here for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you very much. Perhaps this is a good moment to remind viewers that you can absolutely submit questions under the Slido platform. We welcome this very much. And maybe if you're not familiar with how it works, there's a link inserted into the YouTube biography and also on the event webpage. And I think now that we've heard at least once from each speaker, I'll start to weave any questions coming in when the moment seems right for discussion flow. So moving on, I wanted to dive a bit deeper into something many of you have picked up on actually in your first interventions, which was the public harm principle that Sally outlined in her presentation of the issue paper. And what I was wondering to hear more about was how might we determine publicness actually and its relationship with societal systems. I think maybe based on the interventions we heard, Carolina, it might be interesting to hear from you first on this one, if that's all right.
Well, thank you. I think what Sally did very well, she actually linked the notion of course, of course, I'm talking from the perspective of a media company and thereby pluralism. And for us, pluralism means balancing out internal pluralism and external pluralism. What Sally did very well, she linked external pluralism to the DMA, but what about internal pluralism? If I look at as a media company, in our experience, internal pluralism is sought and promoted via very specific ex-ante rules. And I think this is what the DSA can set like a basis for additional provisions to come in. But if I look, I'm sorry, I'm getting a bit off track, but going back to Sally's paper, you know, when she says that she relates to the external pluralism, media ownership rules, basically, and here, this is not even tackled in the DMA. So, but perhaps it is worth considering in terms of number of users and audiences that external pluralism in the media is defined both in terms of audience share, so market share in terms of audience, but also market share in terms of resources. And so I think, you know, having increased due diligence obligations proportional to size is also consistent with the need maybe to look at the market share in the advertising market of these giant big tech behemoths. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah, definitely food for thought on market share, which is also a concept that we see to an extent in the DMA too. So thank you. Laura, maybe I'll come to you next on this one.
Thank you. So basically, from what I might take away from Sally's paper about the publicness, so the dimension, the public harm, basically, I think we can summarize that by looking at it under 3 different dimensions. So on the one hand, we're looking at the ability, let's say, at harm as accumulation of private harm, and that therefore can reach a large scale and can impact society. But then there is also a dimension linked to the ability of the platform to impair the functioning of certain key systems. And then the third dimension, which I separate, but it's probably the fact that yes, that basically the platform can imply, can, let's say, facilitate or undermine actually the functioning of certain public institutions or public processes. So I think these are kind of 3 different dimensions, which are not at this stage, especially when we look at how the DSA plans to, let's say, to impose a number of additional obligations on certain operators to basically prevent or contain systemic risk of harm. Maybe not all of these 3 dimensions, I mean, at this stage are actually taken into account. And I think the main focus is now perhaps possibly more on the accumulation side of harm, so on the sides, whereas the other 2 dimensions are missing. And those are more linked to the ability of platforms to play a central role. And actually also, this is something that the Commission acknowledged both in the impact assessment and in the explanatory memorandum. So that this is basically, these are additional dimensions that should also be incorporated possibly in the way the DSA look at systemic risk. And then also when looking at making the parallelism with the financial sector regulation, there again, this is slightly different. I mean, again, my reading of Sally's paper is that we are there looking more at the ability of platforms to propagate harm, let's say, across different systems. So this is really, this requires basically looking at whether and how the platform is interconnected with other systems or parts of the society. And so, I don't know, but basically what I'm trying to say is that I think these are all interesting elements that should possibly be incorporated in the DSA to basically make sure that the right operators then, are basically engaging in the risk assessment practices which are necessary to prevent and to contain those type of risks. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Laura. And of course, the time to get the DSA right, by whatever we mean by that, is certainly now, as it's evolving fast. Sally, I think to come to you, because maybe on this notion of publicness, might you have anything to add compared to the presentation as you hear remarks?
Yes, I just wanted to come back to the notion of publicness, as I've talked about it in this paper, doesn't undermine the fact that large reach also constitutes publicness. And this was why Alexander de Streel and I, in our recommendations that came out right before the DSA was published, we talked about platforms as public spaces and the extent to which these are. And so when you do have 45 million users, probably you are also a public space. So reach can be certainly part of the measure of what constitutes public. But my paper, looking at it from this perspective that I did, also said there are other aspects as well. So I guess what I'm saying is the ways that I'm talking about publicness are kind of in addition to the public space creation that is done by large reach.
That's a helpful clarification. Thank you, Sally. Tania, maybe just to quickly come to you, because I don't think in the online harms bill, as we've seen so far, we have quite the same concept.
Yeah, I think maybe the key dimension is that the online safety bill, as it's branded these days, focuses on individual harms and does not include societal harms. And obviously the bill is in early stages, so we'll have to see whether it stays that way. But to the extent it does, you might end up seeing some divergence between where the DSA ends up and where the online safety bill ends up, and particularly around potential impacts on things like electoral processes might be potentially in the DSA, potentially not in the online safety bill. So I think that's probably a dimension to explore further as the debate continues.
Thank you, Tania. That's a helpful clarification, and total rookie error on my side to think of the old terminology. So thanks for correcting me. Matt, how about you on publicness and the systemic aspect?
Thanks, Lara. Well, I think just two very quick observations. I think the first would be, in trying to define publicness, let's not reinvent the wheel. We do already have in EU law some important definitions that we can refer to when approaching this through the lens of the DSA. So obviously we have the notion of communication to the public in relation to copyright law and codified in the Copyright Directive. And we also have a notion of dissemination to the public, which is included within the terrorist content regulation. And I think both of those would give us important tools to understand exactly when a service goes beyond hosting of material in what is essentially a closed or a predetermined environment, and making material available, disseminating that to an undetermined or undefined group of third parties. So these are established concepts that we have and we can actually use, I think, when designing the appropriate rules that should apply to hosting service providers, online platforms, and then very large online platforms in the context of the DSA. The second comment that I had, which is really in relation to one of the concrete recommendations in your study, Sally, is this notion of the member state perspective, and in a way empowering member states to define what constitutes systemic risk within their territory. And it's a really novel idea, and one that I think, obviously, it carries a lot of weight, but I would say we would ask to proceed with caution in this area, because it would seem to be verging more closely towards a country of destination rather than a country of origin principle. And the country of origin principle is something that we very strongly support in the context of the DSA, and think really is foundational to the sort of the success of e-commerce and digital services across the single market. And I'm aware that we've seen some various different texts being discussed under the DSA, that there could be a requirement even to undertake your risk assessment process per member state, rather than doing it across the board as a service provider active in the single market. And that in itself would seem to chip away at this notion that you have a country of origin principle. So I would just raise a note of caution in the way that that's formulated in the report, and the fact that it could eventually lead to some more fragmentation that we're very keen to avoid. But I'm definitely not offering a solution here, because I completely understand the point you make around smaller member states where a significant proportion of users could be on a certain platform, and in the context of that population, it then presents a systemic risk, but not one across the single market. So I don't have a solution, but I'm just raising that as a kind of concern, arising from this discussion.
Thank you, Matt. It's a very valid concern indeed. And actually, I know, as before introducing the panel, I pointed to some more work CERRE is doing in this area around looking at the linkages between country of origin, country of destination, as they're now evolving with all these new pieces of regulation coming into force. And of course, with more centralized enforcement, as we are set to see in the DMA and DSA. So stay tuned, viewers, for more on that. And hopefully we can start to explore some of those questions as well as in maybe a third round from speakers, which we're running well on time to take, I'm delighted to say. And again, to viewers, please don't be shy about asking questions via the Slido, #CERRE platforms, here to take them if at all possible. But I mean, one thing I think we really do need to make sure to do, having thought about publicness versus systemicness, is actually to reflect more deeply on how we define systemic, as we've started to do, and the implications of these risk assessments, which again we've already started to talk about, and Matt, I think you've just brought into play a bit more clearly too. If we have the opportunity to think more about those now with a quick round, let's try to do that. And maybe Laura, I'll come to you first on this one.
Thank you, Lara. So yeah, that on the notion of the notion of systemic risk and how we can better define that for the purposes of the DSA. I think based on what we also did, what this work has drawn attention to, and the fact that we have identified different potential dimensions of harm, I think it would be very important to basically have a definition which takes into account the specificities of the different platforms in terms of the type of role they can play for society, and for facilitating public debate, and for actually disseminating content to a large scale. And so what I'm trying to say is that besides the number of users, this could possibly be assessed by taking into account the specificity of the business model of the platform to make sure that actually they are in a position to create that type of harm. And then the second thing that could be taken into account is actually how the platform is run, and the actual operating model of the platform, to make sure that because the number of users, high number of users right now is create a presumption of harm. But then it would be great to incorporate also to take into account how and whether platforms have been able to already kind of mitigate that type of risk. And this can be done by looking at how the platform is actually designed and the type of functionalities that it offers, whether or not it allows virality in the first place, or all those mechanisms that actually can propagate quickly and spread very largely illegal content and harm. So and then yes, so I would say that the focus ideally should be, and again, I also agree with what has been already said about the fact that we are already at an advanced stage of the discussions. But looking at what we have right now in the proposal, probably the best way would be to also introduce additional criteria which allow a better assessment of the specificities of the platform. And this also could be a way to address, what Sally has stressed, about the importance of having also the member state input on the potential role played at the national level. And I think that having this type of qualitative, or let's say other criteria that take into account actually the type of role and the way the platform is operated could also, basically address that shortcoming, and without the need to rethink of the whole process, and possibly also create some tensions with the country of origin principle. And I will pause here.
Oh, thank you, Laura. Thank you. Maybe Tania, we'll hear from you next.
I think those are really good observations by Laura, and what I might do is just take a sort of more pragmatic approach and reflect a bit on Carolina's point that maybe we're a very advanced stage. What might be particularly helpful in terms of the risk assessments is that over time, it might help us understand better over time to what extent things like functionalities, interconnectedness can or cannot be a facilitator of risk of harm. And maybe over time, that can help us understand a little bit better to what extent we want to add to the categorizations in the DSA to get to the VLOPs. And I'll probably stop there, give others an opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Tania. It's also good to see over time, as the law being in force, how it advances and evolves over time, and how it adapts over time. So thank you, thinking of it as a dynamic instrument there. Matt, how about you?
Thanks, Lara. I think maybe just to respond to the question that you've kindly posted in the chat, because I think it elaborates on this discussion we were having earlier about systemicness, and it hits on a really live risk, which is to say, we do have some established concepts, in EU law that we can draw upon when designing the DSA, but systemicness, particularly in the context of illegal content or content moderation, is probably not one of them, actually, and it's a concern that again, not being too reactive to the different text and discussions that we see in Brussels, but in some amendments there's a suggestion that this notion of systemicness and risk assessment tied to systemicness should be required of online platforms without having a workable definition of the concept to begin with. Could be really problematic, actually. And I think the report actually presents some really useful ideas here, and we had this discussion offline as well, which is to say, first of all, we borrow from the concepts that you have in financial services, and you look at particularly there, some of the things that strike us as being most relevant is the contagion effect. So either the failure of a given service, the collapse of a service, or the malfunctioning of a service gives rise to problems not only to that firm, but to the entire ecosystem. And that could be customers, it could be other firms in that sector, and it becomes a problem that spreads, has a contagion or a domino effect. And that really is something, I think, an important concept that we could draw upon when we look at systemicness. I think what isn't as clear, actually, at this stage is the extent to which any of the platforms who we would be discussing in the context of being designated as VLOPs exhibit the same qualities that you'd have with a financial services provider in relation to their service not functioning or not being available to certain customers, and maybe that's something that evolves into the future, but right now I do think it's a concern that it isn't a well-established concept, when we look at regulation of digital services, and in particular in relation to tackling illegal and harmful content. So again, I'm not offering a solution, but I'm raising a red flag, as we go about, kind of drafting this particular regulation.
I mean, maybe we need a few more pieces of research before we start to come up with some conclusions. And I mean, I think it is worth spending a moment on just quite how much work goes into thinking through these concepts to even get to the sort of stage we are now of our debates. today. Thank you, Matt. And you also alluded to, Matt, before I come to Carolina, a question that was asked by a viewer, which was on publicness already being defined in EU law, but what are previous traces of systemicness in other EU law, if any at all? And that's what you were responding to there. And I think, Sally, we'll have to come to you on that as well. But before we do that, Carolina, I think it would still be good to hear from you on defining systemic and the implications of the risk assessment. So over to you.
One quick remark on the definition of systemic risk, because there is also another side. While risk indeed can arise from the interplay among different services, we are all very well aware by now of the lock-in effects and low interoperability levels, which actually push users into echo chambers and leading to the negative externalities that Sally explained very well in her paper. So we believe that stronger interoperability obligations could prevent this. And another aspect, which is more DMA, but it's also related to what we're discussing here today, is that network effects and self-preferencing practices also nudge users into closed environments that actually lock them in closed environment where different services are all offered by the same undertaking. And all of these issues have actually identified by the Commission, which I praise by the great job they've done in coming to this general public awareness of what was unknown until, say, a couple of years ago. But what's interesting here is that the US, with the bipartisan bill, I think it's called American Innovation and Choice Online Act, actually does address the same issues. So, I'd like to make a link to the TTC, to this transatlantic dialogue, and really hope that this paper can, provide additional issues that can be addressed in a jointly manner across the ocean. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolina. It's very relevant to mention the US, in the series of events that CERRE held earlier in the year, which we termed our DMA and DSA Rendezvous series. We had it as a kind of series signature to have a US perspective offered on how this package of legislation that we're developing here, how it's being viewed in the US and what they consider the impacts sideways, I suppose, there will be. And with the TTC, indeed, CERRE was actually very lucky to be invited to participate in one of the stakeholder roundtables. And there was a lot of emphasis from the politicians on the importance of stakeholder dialogue and paying close attention to this. So definite validity for having debates such as this today. I'd like to just come back to Sally on that question about systemicness and other traces in EU law. As an academic, you might have some points to add there, so I'll take the opportunity.
Well, of course, I don't have the knowledge of the entirety of EU law, but from what I looked at for the purposes of this paper, what I saw in the financial regulation, that was 1025 related, that it basically empowered the ECB to intervene. There were two things that kind of, I think, are relevant. One is the sort of cross-jurisdictional reach, this idea that there were some kind of subsidiary, and the other one was also the extent of connection on the business side, and that's something that we don't have. So there isn't really a measure of this interlinkaging. And I mean, one thing might be that if something is declared a gatekeeper in the DMA, then it automatically should be considered as, whether or not it's a VLOP as well, for the purpose of the DSA, because that does signify a certain level of interlinkages. That would maybe be imprecise. But, we need some very narrow and very specific criteria if we're going to go beyond user thresholds. So I'm not arguing for opening up a huge Pandora's box here. But I think we do have precedents in terms of how systemic is dealt with in other regulations to put in something related to interlinkages with other businesses. I made a kind of when Matt started talking about, you know, member state level risk assessments, you know, as somebody who comes from an audiovisual media services background originally, yes, I completely also believe in the country of origin principle, and we would be in a great mess if we tried to do this otherwise. My argument in terms of member states is the ability to flag something up for review as a VLOP. So I would not suggest that platforms should be required to do member state by member state risk assessment, because that wouldn't even make sense in terms of the nature of how these harms function, right? But a member state, I think, member state authorities, digital service coordinators with the member states authorities should be able to say, flag to the board and the commission to say, this one is a problem in our member state system, in our society. Can you assess whether or not this perhaps also needs to be considered a VLOP for these reasons? And the other thing about systemic risk is that a systemic risk, as we would end up looking at it in the European perspective, is going to be different than an American perspective, right? We bring our norms. So the very kind of American interpretation of freedom of expression wouldn't be necessarily what informs systemic risk assessment within the EU, because we have a different way of interpreting and freedom of expression and communication rights. Yeah? So I think that another aspect of systemic risk is that it is to some extent sort of normatively and culturally defined by where it is. Now, another thing that comes to mind to point out is that we need to leave the job to some extent of for the risk assessment level. So things like a lot of functionality issues and ways things related to the way the business model functions might be stuff that is taken into consideration in the assessment. Right? So we have one job that needs to be done, I think, which is slightly nuancing the how something gets triggered and designated as a VLOP, right? Which I think needs to have some kind of membership flagging. But the other aspect, and I hope that this work contributes to thinking about that, is what do we then assess when we're looking at a risk assessment, right? Now, harm is not mitigated by a risk assessment. A risk assessment understands the harm and also considers the steps that are being taken in order to mitigate harms, right? Or the ways that functionalities might themselves mitigate certain harms. So I think we can think there's going to be quite a lot of work to be done now in terms of how this concept of systemic risk and the idea of assessing it gets translated into this space. So we can look to that, for future research, as we academics are wont to do. There's always future research that will be done, but that's going to be a big job to be done after the fact in the DSA.
Thank you. And indeed, we are looking very much after the fact at this point too. We'll see to what timetable the DSA does end up getting agreed. I also think, Sally, it's very interesting that the word culturally defined and culture came up because, you mentioned AVMSD and that was negotiated as much in a culture space as it was in a sort of digital single market regulation space, and is one of the concepts at the core of the country of origin principle too. There is a question coming in from press, from MLX, and it's for Lara Ceriti. Laura, I hope you're okay to take this. And it was just about asking whether the UK's age-appropriate design code should inspire EU legislation to effectively tackle child sexual abuse online. Do you have any thoughts on that, Laura?
Well, I mean, not in the context of the DSA, in the sense that I think that, of course, that's a very interesting work, which is being now proposed. But I think if we look at how the DSA is trying to be an horizontal measure, which actually addresses different type of harms. I'm not sure how much of that could be actually imported in the DSA, and yeah, so I would say not sure that's actually something, especially if we're looking again what we're discussing today, and we're trying to understand how the DSA can actually prevent systemic risk, and trying to give reflect upon how basically the notion of systemic risk could be better incorporated in also the definition of very large online platforms. I would say, yeah, so I don't think that's, yeah, I would reply that I'm not sure that could be useful for the DSA, but yeah, I would close here.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you indeed. And actually, another question that's a bit on the UK angle, which I guess shows that we all really have to be working together in terms of how we think of harm, which is to understand from Tania whether you think, Tania, there might be a risk of overburdening small service providers in the UK with risk assessment requirements for illegal content. Is that a proportionate requirement? That's the last question I'll take before starting to wrap up the session.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, ultimately, it's up for UK policymakers to make that decision. So what I'll focus on is whether there are ways for us to reduce that regulatory burden in a way that makes it proportionate. And for example, what you might think about is whether there might be scope for us to write guidelines, for example, about how you can do such a risk assessment. And also make it easier for smaller businesses to comply, for example, by sharing things like good practice, or by organizing stakeholder or industry-wide discussions that can help share that information and that knowledge across businesses to facilitate that, and as a result of that, reduce that cost of regulation. And the second thing I would say as well is that, as Sally makes a really good point, it's not the risk assessment in and of itself that is going to tackle harm. It's about what's done about the risks that have been identified. And as the online safety bill is currently drafted, the suggestion is that any measures that should be taken should be proportionate to the risk. So again, that should limit the sort of risk of excessive regulatory burden. And really what the beauty of this risk assessment approach is that what you do is you put the onus on companies to take responsibility for the safety of their users, rather than have a regulator that might need to list everything and come up as a result of that with very ineffective regulation. So I think, if anything, the risk assessment proportionate approach framework is one way that allows us to tailor the approach to the wide variety of the type of businesses that might be in scope, and as such, actually, hopefully mitigate disproportionate regulation.
Thank you so much, Tania. Very helpful, and I think we're going to need to start sort of gently wrapping up the session. And what I'd really like to do before giving Sally as the paper author the sort of final words is to, if possible, for our distinguished panelists to have a sort of top line takeaway. Is there anything arising from this debate that has surprised you or that's stayed with you, or is there a one-liner from the paper that you really think, if there's a main message for us to take away, what should that be? We'll have many more discussions on harm, on content regulation around the DSA. That work doesn't stop for CERRE, but maybe a top line from each of you to close. And I'm just going to go in the order in which I see on my screen. Matt.
Thanks, Lara. I normally benefit from alphabetical order as well, so this is often the way. Yeah, thank you for the discussion. Really, really helpful. I think from our perspective, key takeaways from the report. Well, I mean, it's a rhetorical title. What is the harm in size? And I think what we've demonstrated here is there certainly are important, demonstrable, non-economic harms that arise, particularly because of scale, because of bigness in the context of online platforms, and it's absolutely appropriate that the DSA should address those. And in fact, the reality is many of the things that make the platforms themselves so attractive to users derive from that size, the ability to share content widely, to communicate very quickly and broadly with people. But that in itself is what gives rise to the harm. So it's sort of innate in the nature of some of these businesses that there's a risk that needs to be addressed. And from our perspective, this has just been a really good opportunity to get back to basics and to ground the discussion on which obligations should apply to which service providers in the context of the DSA on the harm that is posed, and using that as the key kind of metric or benchmark for determining where those obligations should sit.
Thank you, Matt. Very clearly expressed for what might otherwise be quite a concept to wrap our heads around. So thank you so much. Laura, over to you.
Thank you. So I think from our perspective, the main takeaway, so definitely the fact that we have understood, this paper helps further exploring the sources of harm and the different dimensions of harm, and therefore suggests that we need to take into account additional criteria when identifying very large operators that are prone to creating that type of risk, systemic risk. And those criteria actually go back to what we discussed already today, the role played by the platform, their ability to control key functions of society, or to basically have an enabling role for society. But also, I think what we have learned is that, especially when we look at the notion from the financial regulation perspective, there is also this element of interconnectedness, and this is something that, as Sally also suggests in the paper, this is something that it's possibly difficult for a platform themselves to capture, and this possibly it's something that needs to be taken into account by the digital service coordinator or the commission, depending on how the DSA now evolves, but possibly to have an outsider perspective and to make sure that all the different interconnection and elements, interdependence, interlinkages are taken into account in the designation process for the VLOP. I also finally think that going back to proportionality and to the importance of the cost of regulation and making sure that this is not disproportionate for operators, I think the other important takeaway is possibly that there need to be also consideration for the mitigation measures and practices which have been already taken into account by a number of companies to basically limit the spread of illegal content, and that should also be reflected in the approach to designating very large online platform, because in the end, it's true that we are now focusing the discussion on the risk assessment, which is a specific requirement for VLOP, but there are also additional obligations which would be that very large online platform would be subject to, and so it's important to strike the good balance already at the upstream, like by defining and targeting, making sure that these additional obligations are targeting the right operators without creating additional costs for operators which are not problematic in the sense of not able to create systemic risk. So thank you.
Laura, right, we are really running close on time, but in the interest of democracy, I want to make sure I come to Carolina, Tania too, and of course Sally for a final word. So if we could do that as concisely as possible, it would be great. Thank you. Carolina.
Well, I was just thinking that, Sally suggested that theoretically, even a small actor playing a critical role in the system could also present a sizable exposure to risk if a large number of other players depend on it. And I really can't at present come up with an example because of killer acquisitions, whatever, because of the state of the market at present. And of course, the DSA will address hopefully will be a sound piece of legislation for the next 20 years. But, you know, at present, I can't really think of a small player that has an impact on potential systemic risk. But that's just another remark. Thank you.
Carolina, thank you very much. Tania.
Yeah, just a small comment. I think what the paper does really well is illustrate that risk of harm is not always directly related to overall number of users. And really, I think there are a couple of dimensions in which you can reflect that. You can make your thresholds more nuanced, or what you can do is you consider as a policymaker whether some of the interventions that you've reserved for VLOPs might be potentially proportionate as well elsewhere in the system. With the example in the UK where risk assessments are sort of for illegal content, something that will apply more generally.
Thank you so much, Tania. And Sally, of course, we need to hear from you before we close. Thank you again. What are your top takeaways from this debate? And congratulations again on the paper being published. We need you to unmute.
Thanks everyone for the interesting discussion and the comments. It's also given me a lot to think about going forward. Yes, at the moment we maybe don't have a small one that has a critical role, but that's part and parcel of the theoretical idea of systemic risk. Assessing systemic risk is about also looking at who's bearing the costs. And if we think about, you know, young people self-harming or the consequences of voter suppression due to you know, misinformation, then it's society, it's the public health system, it's our democracy that is bearing the cost. Right? So assessing the risk of systemic harm, which is about assessing, and the DSA does this well, is about systemic risk to society, not just to the users of any given platform. It is about also looking at where is the cost, and so systemic risk is going to be looking at, okay, if the platforms are bearing enough cost of trying to mitigate it, or is it not? So I think there's going to be a lot of work to be doing, you know, next phase, so to speak, in terms of systemic risk, but we should pin down a little bit better what are the systems that we're talking about, and how do we trigger something as being a VLOP that needs to examine all of this. Thank you
so much, Sally. Thank you. Great way to close. And it is time to close. Thank you for bearing with us a couple more minutes. Thanks to all our fantastic speakers, really rounded set of contributions that we're going to take away, crunch through and think about and see how we can weave in to our next set of work. Please do consider signing up for the CERRE newsletter. You'll see there and on our website that we do have a couple more events. I mentioned a hat trick at the beginning. Our next event is on Thursday evening, 21st of October, 6 p.m. CET, and this will be a live stream debate available on our YouTube channel between Commissioner Thierry Breton, Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger, moderated by our Director General Babert, and it will be on the chips crunch, an EU third way to strategic autonomy in semiconductors. Very live issue, of course. I will be back on this YouTube channel on Monday, 25th of October, 2 p.m. CET, to facilitate a great institutional panel at the occasion of us publishing an issue paper on co-investment in network sharing, which updates state of play on our larger study on the same topic from last year, just in case it rang a bell, and proving again that we do like to continue on work streams and keep reflecting where we can. So more DSA events to follow. Hope to see you at one of our future events. Thanks for staying with us and wishing you a good rest of the day. Bye, and thank you again.